Good afternoon. Welcome back to the B&H Virtual Event Space. Today, we're going to be talking about photographing the Milky Way. And for that, we'd like to welcome back Jess Santos. Jess, what's going on?
Not much. Ready
Great
to talk about my favorite subject.
Your favorite subject. And for everyone out there who always asks this question, myself included, because I'm past the point where I can just turn the ISO up to 56,000 and tell everyone that the noise is stars. We're going to learn how to do it the right way. So we're going to get the comprehensive guide to the Milky Way photography thing. A huge thank you to Sony for hosting today's event, and a special welcome to everybody joining us on B&H's main Facebook page, as well as on the Event Spaces YouTube page. If you guys haven't checked it out, go check it out. It is where we stream all of our content live, and it lives there. So if you don't make it live, you can always watch it at your own leisure. But Jess, I know you have a lot to get into, so I'm going to turn it over to you, and I'll see you in a bit for some Q&A.
Sounds great. Let me share my screen here and press play. So today we're talking about my favorite subject to focus, to shoot and focus is the Milky Way. I love astrophotography. And there's several different ways to photograph the Milky Way. And we're going to talk about the most popular ones and some other good stuff. So let's get started. I want to start off with a story time. I've shown my very first picture of the stars here on the left, and the same location or similar location that I would shoot it today. I just want to tell you guys about my very first time photographing the stars and what I was like, heck yeah, I'm photographing the Milky Way, which turns out it's not. But I had got it in my head in 2017 that I wanted to go out and take pictures of the stars. So I spent the whole afternoon looking up blogs and YouTube videos and everything I needed to go take these pictures. And my main concern, and we'll talk about it a little later, was focusing. And there was no real guide on how to focus on the stars that I could find. And so someone had said, if you go outside on your street and then focus at something really far in the distance and manual focus, tape down your lens, and then go shoot the stars, it'll be good. So that's what I did. And then at about 11 o'clock at night, I was in Vegas at the time, and I called up my friend and I was like, hey, you want to go photograph the stars out in Death Valley? And he's like, heck yeah. So we ended up driving out to Death Valley, about 2 hours away from Vegas. And the only place I had been to in Death Valley at this time was Badwater Basin. And I had been there with a wedding photographer friend of mine on a shoot that she had. And instead of parking in the Badwater Basin parking lot and walking down the trail, et cetera, she had parked on the side of the road about a half a mile ahead of it and walked into the desert over rocks and mud. And eventually we got to the salt flats. So I was like, heck yeah, we're going to do this. So I parked exactly where she had parked, and we start walking into the desert at about 1 a.m. And I noticed my Jeep on the road getting smaller and smaller, and I could barely see it anymore. And so I was like, probably going to get lost out here if I walk any further. So we're like, let's shoot the stars right here. So we set up our tripods and our camera, and this is the picture I came up with. At first, it was a silhouetted mountain and very black foreground. And I was like, hey, I'm going to light paint this because I heard some people do that. And so I used my phone and I light painted this beautiful foreground of rocks and mud. And you can actually kind of see on the horizon, if you look really closely, that we actually weren't far from the salt flats, but we didn't quite make it there. Fast forward to about 2 years later, I started getting into blue hour blending, and that's this image on the right. This is more closely related to something I would photograph today. It's a blue hour blend with a stacked sky. But we're going to talk all about single images, stacked images, tracked images, all that good stuff. But the point of this story is that any successful Milky Way shoot starts with a plan. Obviously, I didn't succeed. I didn't even photograph the Milky Way because I didn't know which direction to look in. So we don't often just walk out into the desert at 1 a.m. and get a great shot. If we get a great shot, it usually starts with a plan. So we're going to talk about pre-shoot planning first. There's 3 main things that we need to look at when we're making a plan to go out and photograph the stars. No matter how we photograph the stars, we always want to start with a plan. So it starts by finding dark skies, and these are places where they are far away from light polluted city skies so that the lights of the city don't wash out the Milky Way. Our sky, our night sky, is actually disappearing at a rapid rate because of light pollution. And so it's becoming harder and harder to find these places, but I'm going to walk you through how to find a place. And then we want to be in the new moon phase of the moon. So although we can photograph the Milky Way on a night with full moon, it ends up looking washed out, and it's not likely that it'll be the kind of image you actually want to capture, like something to the left here on this image was captured on a new moon night. And then finally, weather. Although a soft cloud cover can be a really beautiful, magical Milky Way image, and I actually prefer a little cloud cover in my Milky Way images now, but we're usually looking for a cloudless sky and an unobstructed view of the Milky Way core. So the core, if you look on the image to the left, there's a tree in the middle, and then to the right of it, you kind of see a dark, cloudy area. This is known as dark horse, and it's the galactic core that we're kind of chasing after. And so his back legs are next to the tree, and his front legs are to the left of that in his head, and it kind of resembles a little horse. Fun fact, when I went to New Zealand, I found out that this is called the galactic kiwi down there because it resembles a kiwi bird because it's upside down. So just kind of a cool little thing. So how do we find dark skies? I recommend an app, or it's not an app, sorry, a website called darksitefinder.com. And this is a website that shows you a light pollution map, and you can search for a location or even type in your city and find dark skies near your location. As you can see, if you look to the left here in this little phone grab, that's going to be infinitely harder for people east of the center of the United States because there is a lot more population there and a lot more light pollution. As you can see, that's all lit up mostly green and red and orange. That's why a lot of people come to the West Coast or the desert to find dark skies. That doesn't mean it's impossible to find dark skies to shoot on the East Coast. It's just you might have to drive a little bit farther. Now, direction matters. As you can see from my very first image, direction matters when you're shooting the Milky Way. For us in the northern hemisphere, the Milky Way core will appear in the southern part of the sky, approximately from March to October. Those are the more prime Milky Way shooting seasons. So we want to try to avoid areas north of large light polluted cities. So if I press play on this little video here, you can see I'm searching Las Vegas on Dark Sky Finder. And as you can see, it's very, very light polluted there, white, orange, yellow, green. And eventually, as I scroll out, I get to some darker areas. So I'm looking for specifically the black or the dark gray areas. Those are going to be my best opportunities, but I can photograph the night sky from a green, blue, or even purple area if I can't get far enough. Now, and it's actually suggested places for me south of Las Vegas, and those include Mojave National Preserve, Amboy Crater, and even Joshua Tree National Park. To the west of Las Vegas is where Badwater Basin is located. So you can see it's in a dark gray area to the left of Las Vegas. And I'm far enough away at that point from all the light pollution down in the Southern California cities that I can get a clean image. And Death Valley National Park is actually a dark sky accredited park, which means they've taken special measures to reduce their light pollution footprint. But just because it's a dark sky accredited park doesn't mean that it's going to be completely free of light pollution. The cities around it may not have taken the same measures as you can see in Southern California, as well as Las Vegas here. So in Death Valley, you can actually see the light pollution from Las Vegas and from Los Angeles from Death Valley, but it's far enough away that we can get a decently clean image. If I look to the south and I want to go south, I can go to Mojave Preserve or Amboy Crater, which are those two gray and black pins, but the blue pin down there is actually Joshua Tree National Park, which is another dark sky accredited park. However, the cities around it are not dark sky cities. So therefore it's in a blue purple area, which means I can get a view of the Milky Way. I could probably see it with my naked eye. I could get a photograph of it, but the light pollution is so bad around it that it washes out the core. So the darker the sky, the more light and color and detail you'll get in the core. I want to make a note that even though there are gray and black areas above north of Las Vegas, I don't want to go photograph there because I would be aiming my camera into the southern part of the sky. And that would put Las Vegas light pollution between me and the Milky Way. And that's going to wash out my sky images as well. So it's just really important to find dark skies if you can, or the darkest skies you can before you go out and photograph the Milky Way. Hence why I drove 2 hours at 11 p.m. at night to Death Valley. Let's talk about photo pills. This is the end all be all. If you're a landscape photographer, you're probably familiar with photo pills. If you aren't, I highly recommend this app. It gives you all sorts of information for both night images as well as sunset, sunrise, day images, eclipses, meteor showers, anything you may want to know. It's like the all-time best. I want to talk about a couple of pills, they call them, within the app. And the first one is the Photo Pills Planner. And this is mainly used when you're at your house or you're not on location and you want to see where the sun rises, sun sets, where the Milky Way is, and what time of night you should be shooting it, the moon phase, all that good information you can do right from the comfort of your own home. All you have to do is there's a load button at the bottom of the screen. You click this and you type in either the name of the place you want to go. So in this case, I typed in Badwater Basin, or if you have GPS coordinates, you can also put those in. And then it will show you something like this. You can change the date and the time also at the bottom, and then use the slider at the bottom, and I'll illustrate that in a second, to go scan throughout the day or the night to see where certain things are. So in this case, we have my red pin. My red pin is Badwater Basin, and you see those white dots encircling the red pin. That is actually the Milky Way. It does stretch across our entire sky, but the core itself starts in the early season in the southeast part of the sky, and by the late end of the season, October-ish, it's in the southwest part of the sky. So you can see on July 12th, 2023 at 10:32 p.m., the Milky Way core, those larger dots and that thicker white line, is in the about southeast part of the sky, and it will gradually move to the direct south throughout the night. Now, also at the top, I have sunrise, sunset times, moonrise, and moonset times. And this is very key too, because we talked about new moon phase. And for example, July 12th is not a new moon phase. We can see there's a sliver of moon, but the moon rises at 1:30 a.m. and sets at 4:01 p.m., which means that after sunset, so around, let's say 9:30, between 9:30 and around 1 to 1:30, I can get a nice dark sky and a shot of the Milky Way. So we don't always have to have new moon. New moon is just the best time, but we can work around the moonrise and set time. So I'm just going to play this, and you can see as I slide that back and forth how the Milky Way moves throughout the sky at night. Now, if you're in your location, there's a couple of pills, as they're called, that will help you when you're there. First, I want to talk about the moon pill, because this can work whether you're there or not. The moon pill is a complete moon calendar, and you're able to quickly see ahead of time when the moon rises or sets, what phase it's in. And also it shows you the galactic core visibility. So that's that dark horse that we're talking about. So for example, on August 20th in Death Valley, because I can change the date and time and place using the settings. So in Death Valley on August 20th, I can see that the moon rises at 10:02 a.m., sets at 9:44 p.m., and the galactic center is visible until 1:06 a.m. And that means it dips below the horizon after 1:06 a.m. So looking at this, I know I can shoot from approximately 9:45. It might still be a little bright. So let's say 10 o'clock to about 12:30 or 1 o'clock, I can photograph the Milky Way core. So that's really helpful to figure out when you can photograph the Milky Way core. Scouting during the day, is always going to be your best bet. You will always get a better result if you go out to your location and look for composition while the sun is out. You're not going to shoot blind, and you get a lay of the land ahead of time, so you don't park your Jeep and walk away and realize you can't get back to your Jeep if you walk too far. So like, not only is it great for your composition, it's also great for finding a path, the quickest path in and out, etc. So as you're scouting during the day, you can use this night augmented reality or night AR pill. And basically what you do is you hold it up to your composition or your intended composition, hopefully facing the southern-ish part of the sky. And you can use the settings again, just like the moon pill, set your date and time, and actually swipe back and forth to see how the Milky Way core moves throughout the sky. In this case, I was in Washington last month, and I was sitting at this composition waiting for sunset, and I was just curious if the Milky Way lined up. So on August 11th, when I was there, it lined up, but at 6:32 p.m. So it's not quite dark out. So that means that by the time nighttime falls, my Milky Way would probably be a little too far to the right for my liking. I also did check, you can check earlier months when the sun sets earlier to see if it's in the Milky Way in the right position, and either come back or do a composite, which is a whole nother can of worms. But it's just a really helpful tool to see how the Milky Way is actually going to line up in your composition. So we found dark skies. We know where the Milky Way is. We know what day we want to go shoot or need to go shoot and time. Now we have to find clear skies. So clouds cover the core, and some clouds make for great capture, like I said before. However, more often than not, we're looking for an unobstructed view of the Milky Way core specifically. And so my favorite app to use is the Windy app, and you can see the little red icon. That's what the app store, what it looks like. But this is my most often weather app that I use, and it allows me to look for cloud cover, but also for low cloud cover, mid cloud cover, high cloud cover. And I can also look for a lot of other things that might obstruct my view of the Milky Way, like smoke from wildfires, or if I'm in an area where it gets foggy conditions can also obstruct your view of the Milky Way. So it's a great all-around app. I'm going to press play here really fast, and you can see you can favorite locations. So I have Badwater Basin right now favored, and on August 20th at 10 p.m. or it's 95% cloud cover. That's not great, and that's probably due to Hurricane Hillary. But I can also search for low clouds, which would be closer to the horizon, or high clouds, which would be higher. And then I can also look for things like fire intensity. If there's wildfires in the area, I can look for smoke. I can look for fog. There's so many different things. I think it's just a great app all around, whether you shoot more than just the night sky or not. Really great for sunset, sunrise, for wind, all sorts of things. Really, really great app. Other honorable mentions that I just want to mention here, there are many great apps out there and great weather apps. But other ones that I like are Clear Outside is one, and it displays very similar information. It doesn't have as many layers, but it does display low cloud cover, high cloud cover. And I think it does fog as well. But what it also does that Windy doesn't do is it displays a Bortle scale rating. And the Bortle scale is what we use to determine how dark the night sky is. So the lower the number, the darker the sky. So it will show you, say, Bortle 5. Maybe you want to go to a darker location. So that is also very helpful if you don't want to use Dark Sight Finder. And then also My Sunset is another app I use a lot. This is actually better for predicting sunsets and sunrises in terms of how colorful they will be. But if you want to get into blue hour blending, where you shoot your foreground during blue hour, this is also really helpful because blue hour is right after sunset or right before sunrise. So you can determine if there's clouds there or not. So those are my favorite apps for planning. So now that we've planned, we need to get our gear ready. And as photographers, you probably heard this saying, the best camera is the one you have in your pocket. And that's essentially saying, it doesn't matter what kind of camera you have, you can always get great shots with it. But when it comes to night photography, there are some specific requirements to be able to capture the stars effectively. And I've listed them out here. So we're going to want a DSLR or a mirrorless camera. And this should be a camera that has an interchangeable lens so you can switch out the lenses. And then in terms of lenses, we want a wide fast lens. So you're looking for something like a 16 to 35 or a 12 to 24 or a 14 to 24, something like that, that has an aperture that can go to 2.8 or even lower if possible. So we want that wide lens because we're trying to capture our foreground as well as the big giant sky full of stars. So we want to have as much room for our foreground and the Milky Way as we can. So a wider lens is usually a better choice. However, a mid-range lens also works great if you want to capture some more intimate things, but then you get into some different settings. So a 24 to 70, after you've tried some wide angle, you might want to try some mid-range, which is also fun, but you also need that 2.8 or lower. We want a sturdy tripod. This is an absolutely necessity. We're working with longer exposures here, so we can't really handheld shoot the Milky Way, or not the same way that we could from a tripod. And then we're outside, we're in the elements, so wind is a really, really big factor. So we want it to be as sturdy as possible. I like the carbon fiber ones personally. Just something that won't move around, because we don't want to introduce any camera shake either through our hands pressing the buttons or wind or elements. And that brings me to an intervalometer. So this is not necessary. However, it's very, very helpful so that when you're pressing the button, you're not introducing camera shake. This can be external wired, IR, it can be Bluetooth, or most of the newer cameras, Canon, Nikon, Sony, all of them have built-in intervalometers, which is really helpful. So you don't need the extra piece of gear. If you don't have an intervalometer, don't worry. You can go out and still photograph the night sky. Almost every camera has a built-in self timer, 2 second, 5 second, 10 second. We're specifically looking for 2 second, but if you have 5 or 10 seconds, that's fine. And then lastly, a lighting tool, and this is optional, but if you're choosing to take single images, which again, we'll get into, and you don't want your foreground to just be silhouetted, a lighting tool is really helpful. They can light the scene, but you can also get creative with them and do some really cool stuff. So this is the gear that I always have with me. Again, you don't need all this gear, but if you're looking for something, highly recommend. I get asked all the time what I use. I use my Sony a7S III or my Sony a7R4. And then my absolute little baby is my Sony 12 to 24 2.8. That's my dream lens. I absolutely, absolutely love that lens. But good other options if you're shooting with Sony are the 14 millimeter, the 16 to 35, the 20 millimeter, or even the 24 millimeter. And then I have a Sony remote, and this does a lot of other things besides just take the pictures, but it's the Sony RMT P1BT, and it's a wireless remote commander. It's Bluetooth. It's really great. Love that. And then for my tripod, I use a Slick Pro CF 734 legs with 200 D cube ball head. This is lightweight enough that I can go long distances carrying it, but it's also sturdy enough that it doesn't knock over in wind or anything like that. And I've been in some crazy conditions and it hasn't fallen over. So, and then I have, if I'm lighting stuff, my favorite light as of late is the Nanlite PavoTube 26C. It's an RGB LED tube light. And I like this over a Lume Cube or something like that, just because it spreads the light so soft and evenly around the whole thing. The tube light is amazing, and you can dim it down, which we'll talk about later. Let's dive into settings. So we got our plan and we got our gear, and now we need to actually go out and photograph. There's several different ways to photograph the Milky Way. We're going to talk about the most common techniques and why we would choose them and how we can play with them under dark skies. Before we dive into any of those settings, focus is going to be our key. I told you at the beginning that focusing on the stars at night was my biggest obstacle when I went out and first photographed the night sky. So here are some tips and tricks. We're obviously going to be in manual focus to shoot the stars because we're in a low light condition and autofocus doesn't really work. There are some cameras out now that can autofocus the stars at night, but most of us don't have those. So we're going to need the manual focus. And for me, I wear contacts. I don't trust my eyeballs. So this is a little bit of a scary thing when I first started out. But I found that there's two things that can really help us focus on the stars at night. And that's the focus magnifier and focus peaking. So all the major camera brands have this. I've shown the Sony menus to the left here because I have a Sony, but they should be very similar on other cameras. For the focus magnifier, this usually happens in Sony specifically. When you turn your manual focus ring, when you're in manual focus, it automatically magnifies in on default unless you change that setting. However, it doesn't go to the maximum magnification that it can. So it's helpful to set this on a custom key and you can just set it through the custom button menu. For other cameras, you may have to have a touchscreen. You can zoom in. The S3 has that. Or you can, some cameras already have a button to zoom in further. Just make sure you familiarize yourself with that and you know how to get to the maximum magnification. And then the second one is focus peaking. And once you set this up, it will display when objects in your image are in focus, and it's really helpful specifically with the stars. So this is from the A7R4 menus, and this is the peaking setting. But again, it's similar on a lot of different cameras. You usually have these three options. Obviously, we want to turn the peaking display on, and we want to set the peaking level to mid if possible. For Sony, it's low, mid, and high. Low will still make it kind of hard to focus. Mid is just right, like Goldilocks and Three Bears. And then high, it'll think like everything's in focus. And specifically when we're focusing on tiny dots of light, that's not the best. And then the peaking color, it usually has the options. Most cameras have the options of white, yellow, red, and blue. I have chosen red because white blends in with the stars. That's not going to help us very much. Blue blends in with the sky. That's not going to help us very much. And yellow also can blend in with the stars. So red is a stark contrast to the white stars or the blue sky. So it's really helpful. If you have like a red-green deficiency or color blindness, then obviously you're going to want to choose a different color. I would recommend probably blue would be a better option than yellow or white, but do what works for you. So now we've gotten those settings set up. In order to focus on the stars, the quickest and fastest way is to use your live view display or your LCD screen, the back of your camera. And you're going to want to use your focus magnifier to punch in on the brightest star. So get that brightest star as big as you can in the back of your LCD. And then you're going to want to just twist your focus ring. And if you've set it to red, you'll notice there's like a red blob. And as you twist your focus ring and get closer to focus, that red blob will close and it'll become a tiny red dot. And this is how we know that the stars are in focus. If you have trouble finding a bright star, make sure to turn your manual focus to infinity. Even though it might not be in focus, it'll get closer. So if the stars are too out of focus, you won't even see them. So we want to get as close to infinity as we can and then dial it in from there. I also just want to note, as you get into this, you might see planets in the sky. On the image on the left, Jupiter is in the dark horse, the galactic core right now. We don't want to focus on planets. They're big, they're bright, they're glowy. So it seems like the perfect option, but I've just noticed every time I focus on a planet, my stars are a little soft focus. They're not completely out of focus, but they're soft. So try and find a nice bright star. When we're talking about settings in any of the techniques we're going to talk about, we want to avoid majorly two things. We want to get a good exposure, but we want to avoid too much noise or star trails. And there are several different ways to photograph the Milky Way. Each yields a different result, and we use them for a different purpose. But let's talk about the more common ways to capture the stars and their settings and why we might choose to use that particular technique. So I've listed out the three most common. They're single, stacked, and tracked. If you've ever seen any of my posts or any posts on the internet, you might see these words and might know what they mean. or you might not. A single shot is going to be where most night photographers start. If you've never photographed the stars or the Milky Way before, you're going to want to start with a single shot because it's the least complicated or requires the least amount of gear and that sort of thing. So this is where you're going to start. This is capturing the Milky Way and your foreground in a single image. And really what's key here is balancing settings. You're going to have to know your exposure triangle pretty well in this case because you're capturing all that in one go. And then we have stacked images. These are several images, which is what I shoot most often. Several images taken at a very, very high ISO, and they're shot consecutively. And then they're stacked together in post-processing. And the whole point of this is to get all the light and the detail and the color out of the Milky Way by using that really high ISO, but you're sacrificing noise at this point. So when you stack them together in post-processing, it will get rid of all the noise like magic. I cannot explain the technical way right now, but it's like magic. It's great. And then we have tracked, which is it kind of looks like a stack shot, but there's even more detail there. And this requires an extra piece of gear called a star tracker. And this is one image taken at a very low ISO with a super long exposure. We're talking like 10, 20 minutes. So we have these three different kinds. Let's start with a single shot, because this is where, if you've never taken images of the night sky, you're going to want to start here. And you can see my image. This is one of my very first images of the Milky Way. As I started to get into it, this is a single shot on the left here. This is a settings game. And because we are capturing everything all in one frame, we have to balance our settings. We want to capture enough light in our camera with very minimal noise and little to no star trails. So our aperture, we're going to want to start with an f2.8 or lower. This lower aperture gets the most light in, but we don't want to go too low. And I only say this because certain lenses, even though they can go lower, it might not be ideal for Milky Way shooting. For example, the Sony 24 millimeter is an amazing night photography lens. But when you get at an aperture, it goes to 1.4. And when you get down there, you might have some little light infractions, I think they're called. They look like little birds. So I found after some testing, the best setting for shooting the night sky on the 24 millimeter to get these amazing shots is an aperture of 2.2. So this isn't the case for all lenses, because the Sony 14 millimeter, for example, goes down to 1.8, and I can shoot that wide open at 1.8. It's a really great lens to go lower than 2.8. So test it out with your lens, see what it looks like, but we're going to start at about 2.8 for most lenses. And then for our ISO, we want to be at about 3200 ISO to 6400 ISO. We want a high enough ISO to get that brighter image, but we want to keep the noise low. And at these settings between 3200 and 6400, you're going to be fine in terms of noise. You can take out some noise in post-processing, or you might not have any noise at these settings if you're shooting on, say, the S3. So these are high enough to get all that light, but low enough that we don't get any noise, or a very minimal noise, I should say. And then our shutter speed. So we're going to talk later about photo pills and determining shutter speed using photo pills. But for single shots, about 15 seconds is a really good place to start if you have a wide angle lens. But your focal length is going to play an important role here. So if you're shooting at, say, 55 millimeters, 15 seconds is going to be much too long, because you're zoomed in, you'll get star trails. So your shutter speed is going to determine the length of the star trails. And our goal is to get dots and not lines. However, a little bit of lines might not be such a bad thing if we're trying to capture a single shot. So 15 seconds is kind of a good place to start. I want to touch on foreground when doing single shots. I really like, if I was doing a single shot, using a lighting tool or even just your phone is a really great way to illuminate your foreground in the shot so that it's not just a silhouette, unless that's the look you're going for. So this image on the left, you can see this car is like face planted in the ground. It's a really cool spot. But I used two lights here when I shot this image. I used one to light up the outside of the car so you could see the graffiti. And then I used a cheapy little Amazon LED light that changed colors. And I thought this teal blue color, the cyan blue, would be a really good complement for the inside of the car. Now you can see I can't change the brightness setting of that light. So there is some blown out areas in the blue. So if you can find a light where you can adjust the brightness, that's going to be better. But this came out great in my opinion. And it was just really fun to play with different things like that. So get creative with your lighting when you're doing a single shot. You don't just need the lighting to light up your foreground. You can actually do some cool stuff. So let's talk about a stack shot. Stack shot is actually what I shoot most often because it yields a really, really great result, but I don't have to have extra gear to get it. So it's my favorite to shoot. The image on the left is a blue hour blend. So it's a blue hour foreground with a stacked Milky Way. But the importance here when you're shooting stack shots is you want to get the maximum light and color and detail from the Milky Way, but you're sacrificing the noise because you're shooting at a super high ISO, and then you stack them together and the noise disappears. So I'm going to tell you, when I first went out and I heard about stack shots, I'm like, yes, I'm going to do this. Much like my first star blender. This was a blender too, but a learning lesson. I went out and I was like, I'm going to shoot a stack shot. I researched the heck out of it, and I couldn't really find an ISO that I was supposed to shoot at, except that it's a high ISO, right? So I was like, 6,400 is such a high ISO. That's crazy. So I went out and I shot 15 shots consecutively at 6,400. I didn't have an intervalometer. I actually pressed my 2-second timer over and over again until I got to 15 shots and counted. I probably lost count. But I get them back to the computer. I load them up in a program called Starry Landscape Stacker to stack them. I stack them, it goes great. And then I compare my stacked image to one of my single 6,400 images. And do you know what I found? I found that they were pretty much identical. And this was shot on an A7R2 back in the day. So like cameras have only gotten better in terms of noise and stuff like that. But yeah, I was like, well, what's the point? Because it looks the same. So later I found out that you have to be at a much, much higher ISO. So we start out again with an f2.8 aperture or lower if you can. And then our ISO needs to be somewhere between 10,000 and 16,000. Now, through the years, I found that my personal favorite to shoot at is 12,800, but play with 10,000, 12,800, and 16,000 and see what you like the look of, because some things will be brighter and et cetera, et cetera. So I just like 12,800. And then for our shutter speed, we're going to use photo pills, and a pill in photo pills called Spot Stars. And this determines your shutter speed based on your camera, lens, aperture, all that good stuff. And I'll talk about that in the next screen, but that's really, really helpful, even if you wanted to do a single shot. What we're going to do is we're going to go out, we're going to get focused on the stars, and then we're going to dial in these settings, and we're going to take 7 to 20 images consecutively. So this is where an intervalometer is helpful, or a built-in intervalometer is helpful. If not, you can stand there and press the button 7 to 20 times and you'll get a result. And then you take all those images. Again, they have to be one right after the other, minimal time in between. I would say no more than 4 seconds if you can help it. And then you stack them all together in a program called Starry Landscape Stacker, or that's for Mac, or Sequator for PC. And all your noise will be gone, and you'll get all that detail, just like this image on the left, all the detail and the color and the brightness. Now, when do we want to use stacked shots? Stack shots are fun to shoot no matter what, but specifically when we're doing blue hour blends, it's a great use of a stacked sky image because we're shooting our foreground at a very low ISO, 100 ISO, which means no noise. So if I were to put a single shot in there, it would have noise in it, and therefore it would look kind of strange blended with my blue hour foreground. So a stacked shot is a really great opportunity for this. And as a side note, stacking your foreground is also a great opportunity. You can actually use the light from the stars. So say you set up and your shutter speed was 8 seconds for shooting your Milky Way. You got your Milky Way stack all done. Now you can turn your shutter speed to 30 seconds and capture your foreground and stack that as well. So you get all the light from the starlight into your foreground, but then you stack it in the program and you have no noise. So that's another great way to shoot with stacked images. So PhotoPills spot stars, this is really helpful whether you're shooting a single image or a stacked image. I mainly use it for stacked images, but you can use it for single as well, to figure out what your shutter speed should be. So what we're going to do is we're going to go down to spot stars here. We're going to select our focal length. In this case, I put in 12 millimeters. We're going to select our camera. I'm looking for the A7R4. So it has all these cameras in here. And there, I've got it. And then I'm going to change my aperture because my 12 goes to 2.8. And then we have accurate and default. I most often use accurate. And you can see when you click on those, it'll say accurate is useful for large prints. This means pinpoint stars, no star trailing. And if you're doing really large prints, if that's your intention, you won't have any star trails. It'll be a nice clean image. However, if you're just looking to post on social media or just share with your friends or anything like that, default will work really great too. It'll say on there when you click on it, barely noticeable star trails. So the star trails are there, but they're very, very slight and you wouldn't notice them unless they were big and right in your face. Now, because I like to pretend I shoot for prints, which I don't really, but what if I wanted to? I always like to use the accurate one. But again, you can use the default. So you see here on the Sony A7R4 with 12 millimeters at 2.8 pinpoint stars, my shutter speed should be the 8.34 seconds. Not the 500 rule. This is a old school rule and it's not really helpful in most modern cameras. So we want to use the NPF rule. And this actually takes into account your sensor on your camera as well. So obviously I can't go to 8.34 seconds unless I used an intervalometer and dialed it in exactly. So I'm just going to round it down to 8 seconds. In contrast, I'm just going to pull up my phone here. In contrast, in my PhotoPills in spot stars, if I wanted to do default, I would go to 16.68 seconds. Notice that that is double the accurate. So you can do either one of those and still get a great result. Now this is on my R4, which is a 61 megapixel camera. On my S3, which is a 12 megapixel camera, my NPF rule is 13.67 seconds. So notice that I can have a much longer shutter speed on the smaller sensor. So it's really, really good to use this tool because it will be accurate for your camera and your camera sensor size. So I'm just going to briefly touch on a track shot because this is a lot more complicated than any of the other shooting styles for the Milky Way, but I wanted to touch on it and you can do a little more research on your own if you want to get into this. But this is a type of Milky Way shooting that requires an extra piece of gear and it's a super long exposure. So you'll need what's called a tracker or a star tracker, a photography star tracker, not to be confused with the ones for telescopes and stuff like that. But this is a motorized equatorial mount that fits beneath your camera on top of your tripod, and it allows your camera to follow the stars as they move throughout the sky during the night with the rotation of the Earth. So what you would essentially do is you have this extra piece of equipment and you set it all up and you align it with the North Star. So you have to do some polar aligning. And usually with a laser pointer, you look through a little scope or a hole and you line up the North Star within that. And then you can change your camera to shoot in the south direction. And basically what you're doing here is you're aligning it with the North Star. And so as it turns with the rotation of the Earth. That's in the Northern Hemisphere. The Southern Hemisphere is a different thing. So once we get our tracker all set up, we're going to want to have an aperture of f3.2 to 5.6. And using that higher aperture, because we have such a long shutter speed, which I'll get to. So we want a higher aperture to reduce that light a little bit, but it also gives us the opportunity to capture starbursts So similar to if you're shooting into the sun and you're at f/22, you get that sunburst effect. You can get the same with the stars at a higher aperture. I know the Sony 20mm and the 24, I've gotten it with that. It's usually with a prime lens that you get that, but if you're lucky, you can capture those. For our ISO, we're going to want the lowest ISO possible. So around 500, 540 to 800 is really kind of where you're aiming at. And the goal here is to have a low ISO. So we have the least noise. Because we have this star tracker that rotates with the Earth, we can do a shutter speed of 10, 20 minutes, even longer sometimes if you're really good at it. But if you don't want to go for 10 or 20 minutes, you can also track for 2.5 minutes, which will give you a really good result. But I say, if I'm setting up my tracker, I'm going to go big. I'm going to go as long as possible because I didn't set up all that equipment for nothing. So you're going to want to try and shoot as long as you can to get those really, really nice Milky Way images, as you see here on the left. This gives you a lot of color and light, similar to stacking. As you can see, there's stars that have different colors, and the Milky Way has its own colors. So doing a stacked or a track shot will give you the best results for those. And I wanted to touch on white balance really fast before we move on. White balance, this applies to all of the types of Milky Way shooting, but we want to try and set our white balance in camera because that gives us less editing time. We're already getting it right in camera, so we don't have to move it as much when we get to post-processing. So you want to use kind of a cooler white balance to get that night look, or what we perceive as night, those blues. However, we don't want to go too blue because we want to leave room for all the other colors. Like I said, that star next to Dark Horse, it is orange in color. There's a pink one, there's pinks and golds in the Milky Way. So we want to leave room for the other colors and not just make everything blue. And this is called color separation. So a white balance of 3,800 to 4,200 Kelvin is a really good place to start, or you can select the fluorescent preset is another good option to play with. That's where it has like shade, cloudy, daylight, that sort of thing. You'll have a fluorescent preset there, and it actually adds a little bit of magenta to give you more of the royal blue color. For Sony users, fluorescent cool white 0 is my favorite setting to shoot the night sky. So I just thought I'd throw that in there. I want to touch on one last app that you might need to have. And if you have a tracker, you're likely familiar with this, but just wanted to throw it out here. This is the iOptron Polar Scope app, and this is for polar alignment. Super helpful when you're trying to align your tracker, especially when you're trying to expose for 10 minutes or longer. Long story short, the Earth is on a wobble and the North Star won't always be in the center of your scope. As you can see, the green dot is where the North Star is supposed to be aligned. So you just line up the North Star with that green dot. Now, keep in mind, if you're using a smaller tracker like Slick, Move, Shoot, Move, I think there's a Polaris Vixen or something like that. If you're using any of those, you'll just want to align the North Star in the center because you're going to be shooting shorter exposures, 2.5 to 5 minutes with those kind of trackers. If you're using a Sky Adventure or an iOptron or that kind of tracker, you want to be as accurate as you can with this app so that you can get those long exposures. So now we've shot our sky. What about the foreground? We want to consider this beforehand, but I just want to touch a little bit on foreground and how we can shoot the foreground or how we can capture it with our sky, because it's such an important part of Milky Way photography. Yes, we want to capture the stars, but we also want to have a beautiful foreground as well. We want to really tell a story or creatively capture a more compelling image. So how can we kind of do that? There's different ways to photograph the Milky Way core, and there's also different ways we can capture our foreground, unless we just want a silhouetted foreground. There's light painting and lighting, there's long exposure and stack, there's moonlight if we're taking a single image, and there's a blue hour foreground. So let's just run through a couple of these quickly. When we're working with light, so this is mainly for your stacked or your single images, you might choose to light paint or use what's called low level landscape lighting. This is using a low light to capture the foreground. It's typically during a single exposure or a stacked shot, and the lighting tool is used to illuminate the foreground, and it's placed on a very low setting, 1%, 2%, and it's placed on a tripod or on the ground stationary, very far away from your foreground. And it's meant to mimic moonlight or something along those lines. Just softly illuminate your foreground so you can actually see what's going on there. Then there's light painting, and this is using a lighting tool like that Pavo wand, light painting wand, or a panel or a lume cube. You can use this lighting tool, and typically you're going to swath the light across your scene during a longer exposure for a couple seconds. And you can use it to specifically light up one spot in your foreground, or you can light up your whole scene with it. You can go from different angles. There's a lot here you can do with light painting. I really encourage you guys, if you're wanting to light paint, just go out and do it. Play with it, because you never know what you're going to do, and it might look really cool. So, and then you can also use your light painting tools creatively. In this image on the right, this was a single exposure shot at 14 millimeters, f2.8, ISO 6400, 20 seconds out in Lake Tahoe. And we actually took a lume cube and stuck it under the water, under the lake, so that you could see those rocks under the water, as well as the blue color that Lake Tahoe is known for, and how clear that water is. And it gave us a really cool foreground as opposed to just a static water. Now we can actually see the rocks. So you can do really cool stuff like that, or you can light the inside of a house or an old building. Really, really fun to get creative with light. Then we have long exposure, stacked, and moonlight. A long exposure foreground is taken separately from the Milky Way sky, generally speaking, and it's on a completely dark night or a night with very little light, and you're using a shutter speed into the minutes. We're talking 7 to 10 minutes, and this is actually using starlight to illuminate your foreground. So the duration of the exposure is really going to depend on your aperture, as well as how dark your location is. If you're in a more light polluted area, or if you have a little bit of moon in the sky, you're going to use a shorter exposure. And if you have no light whatsoever, you're going to need a really long exposure. And then we have stacked, like I talked about before during stacking the sky. You can also stack your foreground. I recommend just having an ISO of 12,800 or 10,000 and doing exposures of 30 seconds consecutively. And then you can get your foreground. I would prefer a stacked foreground over a long exposure, only because if I'm taking a 10-minute long exposure and some car drives through my scene and lights up my whole scene, it's likely ruined, not all the way, but likely ruined. And I just wasted 10 minutes of my life on a ruined shot. Whereas if I'm stacking the foreground and a car drives through the scene, I can just get rid of that photo, because nothing in my foreground is moving. Unlike the Milky Way, nothing is moving. So I can just get it out and stack the rest of them. So it gives you a little bit more room for error. And then you have moonlight. Moonlight is a really, really great light to use at night. The moon can be used to light up your foreground, but much like the sun, the best time to capture a single image, that means the Milky Way and the foreground together with the moon, is when the moon is waxing or waning. So when it's a sliver, or setting or rising. So like the sun, we don't often shoot during the day when it's high noon. There's lots of contrast, dark shadows, bright highlights, and it's really hard to work with that kind of dynamic range. The moon is very similar. We're going to want to shoot when the moon is lower on the horizon, so we can get that nice soft light versus the moon being high in the sky. We also kind of want less moon most often, because if the moon is too full, it will wash out the stars in the Milky Way. So again, it's artistic choice, but try and look for those waxing or waning and setting or rising when you're working with the moon. And then finally, blue hour blending, my favorite way to shoot. I just wanted to touch on this. I do have, I believe, a blog article or an event space or something with blue hour blending with B&H that you can look up somewhere. I know it's out there. I think I have a link to it on my website as well. But basically, blue hour blending is when you capture the foreground during blue hour. This is 40 minutes before sunrise or 40 minutes after sunset. And then you blend it with a tracked or a stacked sky. I just want to note that when you're working with blue hour foregrounds, if you're going to go out and try and capture this, you really want to pay attention to the direction of the light. Even though the sun is technically set or not even risen, we're still using the light from the sun to actually illuminate our foreground. So if the sun is backlighting our scene, it's really hard to blend that. It just becomes more difficult. So as you can see this image on the right, the sun actually set directly behind the mountains. You can see kind of in the V of the mountains, there's a little bit of haziness and light that came through. So this was kind of a difficult foreground to work with. However, because the Milky Way lined up right in that V, I got lucky because it looks like that light is coming from the stars and not from the sun. But if the Milky Way had lined up to the right or the left, it would have looked strange to have this light coming from behind the mountains in the V and then the Milky Way off. Where is the light coming from? So just be wary of the direction of light when you're shooting blue hour blends. That's the biggest tip I can give you. And the second biggest tip I can give you is to wait for the glow. Although it's called blue hour, it doesn't last an hour. It lasts more like 15 minutes max. But what happens is the sun will set, it goes behind the horizon, and then the light will get very blah, like it's very bland. There's not a lot of dimension or anything like that. But then all of a sudden there'll be this glow, and you can actually see it change right before your eyes if you're paying attention to the landscape around you. And that's kind of what you're looking for. So my best rule of thumb for this, if you're going to go out and try it and play with it, is set your settings to f11, ISO 100, 30 seconds, and then wait until your histogram or your exposure meter tells you the exposure's right and take the shot. It'll likely be 40 minutes before or after sunset, before sunrise or after sunset. So this image on the left, ISO or F11 for the foreground, ISO 100, 30 seconds. And then I did a sky stack, which was F2.8, 12,800, 8 seconds at 16 millimeters. Lastly, I just want to touch on composition. Again, I probably have some talk or something out there on telling stories through composition, but I think it actually was on B&H Event Space last year or something like that. So you could probably look that up too. But I just want to touch on it just because the Milky Way core is aligned with your image, it's in the frame, doesn't necessarily mean it's a good composition. You really want to have the Milky Way interact with the foreground in a very meaningful way. And then you want to tell a story. Be mindful with your foreground, tell a story through imagery. An image with a story is always going to be more compelling than just an image of the Milky Way. So use compositional tools like leading lines, rule of thirds, all those things to your advantage, but find the story first. In the image on the left, I came across this rock formation or these hoodoos in New Mexico, and this one looked like a brontosaurus to me. If you've ever seen Land Before Time or something, I'm probably aging myself, but it's the long necks. Anyways, it looked like a brontosaurus to me. So I wanted to get really low and close to the ground so that that brontosaurus was towering over the landscape, because I imagine they're huge, as dinosaurs are. And then I wanted it to seem like the brontosaurus was always almost touching the sky, almost touching the stars. So I waited, this is a blend, and I waited until the Milky Way got as close to the brontosaurus as possible so that it would look like he's reaching out and touching the stars because he's that tall. So just find a story through your image. You don't have to see the brontosaurus, but because there's a story there, it's already more compelling. Look at shapes of the rocks or maybe special phenomenon like bioluminescence or wildflowers or fall colors. And how can you capture that moment in time in a way that evokes emotion from the viewer? So just some parting thoughts to leave you guys with. And thank you. That's it.
Thank you so much, Jess. A ton of information, an extra 10 points for the Land Before Time reference there. Let's move into some questions. I know you guys have to have some questions out there. We're going to get it started with John Tobison joining us on Facebook, asking about when you were talking about tracking shots in the foreground. What happens to the foreground as the camera moves to track the stars?
So the foreground will often be silhouetted because you're not lighting it, and it's just a smudgy mess. So you have to blend a track shot with a foreground or just cut it to be just the Milky Way. So if you want to include a foreground, it's a blending situation.
Okay. And I'm guessing the most important thing, or one of the most important things with these shots, outside of all the technical stuff, is giving some sense of atmosphere and sense of place. Like, you can't just take a wide shot of the sky. It's not going to show you anything. It's not going to show you any scale. The interest is in the entire shot, right? Like when you were talking about foreground, how much that adds to the entire shot.
I will say the foreground is 100% most important in the entire shot. The Milky Way should be a supporting cast member, like to this play that you have going on. So unless that's what you're going for, you have to decide whether your focus is the Milky Way or your focus is the foreground. I will say, after shooting the Milky Way for so many years, yes, I enjoy shooting the Milky Way, but it often looks the same unless there's a planet passing through it. So how can you make that more interesting and more compelling as you go on and advance in night photography? So foreground is key.
Okay. And in talking about that, for those who may not be up on this or are newer to this, is there a time of year that is generally best for this?
The best time of year is going to be in the summer. You can shoot the Milky Way from even February to November, but your best time of year is going to be June, July, that area, because you have the night and the Milky Way is already out as soon as the night sets. In March, or as soon as the sun sets, sorry. In March, you're going to have to wait till right before sunrise to capture the Milky Way. That means like 4 a.m. And in fall, you can capture the Milky Way right after the sun sets, but it's only for a brief time because then the core actually goes below the horizon very shortly after. So
okay, so for all the people out there who are wondering, why can't I see it? Or I'm one of them. Don't worry, you guys. I never throw something out there if I'm not included in the focus group. I mean, I guess I kind of always thought it's like, as long as you're facing the right direction.
But the moon, and also the time of year. Yes.
Okay. See, I'm taking notes over here. I'm gonna have to watch
light pollution also is another
light pollution's a huge thing, right?
Yeah.
That's something that, us New Yorkers, we're used to it, to not being able to get shots like this. We got to go out to Utah, Colorado.
There are some dark sky parks on the East Coast, but they're harder to find than out on the West Coast for sure.
Okay, we're gonna have to look into that. Well, Jess, it's always great to have you on. A ton of information. This is something you can't just watch once. We're gonna have to bookmark
replay
this. And we did find that blog post there. So we do have something on our Explorer site talking about Blue Hour. I was gonna say, as you're talking about Blue Hour, I'm like, she loves.
I was
Blue
like,
Hour. I know we've done something.
I was like, I don't know if I did it on Event Space, but I know for sure I read a blog because I was out with some B&H team a few years ago and I did a whole article on it. So
yeah, I'm sure we got a bunch. If you guys just Google Jess.
Jess and B&H, you'll have so much information. You can learn about color theory, composition, everything.
Editing. I think we've had you on to do live edits. So whatever you guys want, from pre-production to post-production, we got you there. But Jess, a huge thank you to you as always for joining us, and Sony for hosting these wonderful events. And to all of our viewers out there, we can't do it without you guys. So thank you for you guys tuning in. But alas, another rendition of the B&H virtual event space now in the books. Catch y'all next time.